For the last 3 or so days, I've been binging on Kingdom Come Deliverance, waiting for this blocked nose to fix itself, because if I took any more decongestants, the amount of paracetamol in them would make my liver stop working. But it got me thinking, when we call a game realistic, what do we actually mean? And here is where I would put the intro if I had an intro with a little song, which I do not own. Actually, John, just listen to some shit I've been making in FL Studio. Actually, also before I start the video, I'm going to change my shirt because I look really fat at this angle. Promise I'm not. I'm not fat. I'm like triangle shaped. It's just, this is too big and it doesn't really... You know what I mean? So be right back. I'm back! Wearing a normal t-shirt and pyjama bottoms because I have no social life and who the fuck's gonna stop me? Now, first of all, we have to try and define what we mean by realism, because depending on who you ask, you will get very different results. Like, say, if you asked a nerd who never really left the early 2000s, he'd say how much dark colours there were and how evil the characters were, like how gritty and edgy the story was. If you asked, a game journalist, they'd probably mention like how many minority characters there were. Or if you asked one of the plankheads in the PlayStation Legion, they'd say how nice the graphics looked. But I'm talking about realism purely from a mechanical standpoint, using the metrics that I'm giving... Well, not that I'm giving, the ones that I'm using. Prison Architect is much more realistic than, say, A Way Out. Not that that's anywhere close to a criticism of either of them. Like, just because something's realistic doesn't make it good. And just because something's not realistic and cartoonishly over the top, that also doesn't mean it's good. Or bad. Okay, but that's just like, if God created everything, who created God argument. So... what kind of mechanics am I talking about when I say realistic mechanics? And the answer might shock you. Realism is tedious and boring. That's... if there are mechanics that have you doing something trivial and meaningless, that's probably a realistic mechanic. See, sharpening weapons in Kingdom Come Deliverance. Or hiring a lawyer to pay less tax through loopholes in Prison Architect. Or having to pay for gasoline or petrol in Euro Truck Simulator. Now, on the surface, this just looks like developers shoveling in as much uninteresting garbage as possible just to stretch out the game time a little bit longer. But no, I don't think, most of the time I don't think that's the case. Because these little menial little tasks... like, yes, they do drag you away from the action, but that can be a good thing. Like, it shouldn't just be action, 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 especially with really long games. Like, RPGs especially. Not only does it, spice things up a bit, like with lots of different things to do, it also helps immerse you to a certain extent. Like, you're not just this one-dimensional hack-and-slash monster. Like, you're a normal guy or girl who has to do normal guy or girl things. And just an extra comment on my previous comment about how it's just artificially pads out the game time. If it's not boring as fuck, like it can be a little bit boring, but if it's really boring, like, yeah, then it's an issue. But extra game time isn't a bad thing, and anyone who disagrees, I will happily debate on the topic, if they want. As long as we get to live stream it, because I want to completely humiliate you in front of all of your fans. Who am I kidding? Anyone with a fan base wouldn't dare try me. What was I on about again? Oh yeah, realism. Now, there's a big difference between realism and immersion. Okay? Like, Prison Architect is pretty realistic, at least mechanically, but it's not really that immersive. So, the cartoony art style, all of the HUD elements, etc., etc. It does bring you out of the immersion slightly, and that's sort of the point. The point of Prison Architect was to show you how easy it is to make a for-profit prison dehumanizing when you stop seeing the prisoners as people and just sort of like, ways to make money. Whereas a game like Oh no, any of the Metal Gears. They're not realistic in the slightest, but they are pretty immersive, in my opinion at least. You can probably think of some better examples than those two, but these are just the ones I'm thinking up off the top of my head. But I have a feeling that you're thinking something along the lines of, well, the way you're wording this, it makes realism sound bad. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's good in moderation, but there's a reason simulators aren't perfect, and it's not really because of any technical limitations. It's because absolute realism is kind of boring. Like, if we wanted absolute realism, we just go outside, you know what I mean? The US military actually commissioned a video game to try and show, like, teenagers and young people what serving in the US Army was actually like. And, well, just take a look at the reviews for yourself. And that's essentially propaganda. Like, that's trying to make it look as good as possible. So, if, like, state-sponsored propaganda entertainment that tries to be as realistic as possible, but also tries to hype it up and make it look really good, is received with lukewarm reviews, imagine something that a bunch of game developers could make. They don't really care too much about making what you're doing seem good, but just, you know, trying to make an enjoyable experience, but also at the same time make it as realistic as possible. You can start to understand why it's not really done very often. Okay, but now what about fantasy settings, or sci-fi settings, or whatever? Can they still be realistic, despite the vast majority of the in-game logic not really correlating to our world logic, if that makes sense? For example, should we consider Dark Souls realistic, despite a lot of the logic not making any sense whatsoever if it was in our world, but because of the specific setting, a lot of aspects make a lot more sense. Like, say, the undead curse. Like, you don't meet that many people who aren't undead, which is sort of weird on the surface because the undead curse is kind of rare, but it makes sense once you realise anyone who isn't an undead has died long, long ago. Or how you move slowly, you don't hit that very hard to begin with, your equipment matters more than your actual physical attributes, etc., etc. Like, those things are logical, those things are pretty realistic, but the setting itself isn't realistic in the slightest. Takes a lot of inspiration from history, sure, like specifically medieval Europe, like with its architecture and a lot of the armor designs, especially the lower level ones. Even though almost every fantasy RPG I've ever played, like, they never have gambesons. Why? Gambesons are fucking cool. You can't just wear fucking chainmail and expect it to protect you against anything. Like, they're still hitting you, and hitting you will still hurt, and it will hurt a lot, unless you're wearing a gambeson underneath your armor. You can't just wear chainmail and be fine. Like, yeah, sure, you'll be safe from little fucking daggers, but the majority of Dark Souls and all fantasy RPGs villains in general, they don't have little daggers. They have big, massive, fuck-off greatswords, or huge clubs, or magic and stuff. Like, you need some better protection. And put on a fucking gambeson, because they're a lot lighter, you can move a lot better in them, and they will actually protect you. Although realism has become a bit of a buzzword, you know, it's just one of those meaningless bullshit terms that they just throw in the like E3 conferences and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, it's a diverse cast, it's got an open world, it's got a crafting system, it's got RPG elements, and it's realistic. Like, those 5 terms mean absolutely nothing anymore. Like, they're the norm. And they're not really worth bragging about to begin with. But I could tackle all of those, like, separately. Like, I've talked about diversity for ages. Like, just check out here. I've ranted and raved about how meaningless it is now. You're just basically a fucking idiot if you buy games because of it. And that's not because I hate diversity. No, I'm not explaining myself. Go and watch the fucking video. Okay, but now I want to talk about which kind of genres benefit the most from realism. Okay, I'm going to start off with the ones that don't benefit at all. Okay, adventure games and casual games, okay? Those two, like, if I'm going on a fucking jolly great grand adventure, like, I don't really want realism. Like that's an escapist fantasy. And casual games, like, they're meant to be short, quick, and easy. Like, you can just play them in 5 minutes and have fun. Like, casual games are genuinely just action, 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 because that's why they're casual. Like, you just casually play them when you're bored. Now, these next ones are ones that can benefit from them, but only when they're implemented very well. And these would be action games. And I know action is a bit of a, a vague as fuck term, but I'm talking about shooters, sort of entry-level strategy games, and, oh fuck, I had one more. One sec. Let me think. I had it in the back of my head and now it's gone. Sorry, racing games, that was it. Like, a little bit of realism in the mechanics of a racing game never hurt. But don't go overboard on that, else you'll get, else it won't be fun at all. It'll be like LA Noire. Do you remember how fucking tedious the driving was on that game? Wasn't good. Now, these last genres are the ones that benefit the most from realism, and that would be low fantasy RPGs, like, Kingdom Come Deliverance. It can work in high fantasy, like, sometimes. Like, the thing, high fantasy is a bit like adventure, like, you play it as, like, to experience a whole different world where, you're like a superhero or, like the chosen one or whatever. And the other one is, obviously, simulation games. Like, simulation kind of relies on realistic mechanics to be enjoyable. Else you're just sort of playing like a weird... Well, if a simulation game isn't realistic, you're basically playing one of those joke simulation games, like Goat Simulator. And people only bought that because it was a meme. Like, it wasn't actually good in the slightest. It was a fucking terrible game. And that was the point. Which pisses me off, but normies seem to enjoy that kind of bullshit, so... Just don't appeal to normies with your simulation game. Like, if you're gonna make such a niche genre, if you're gonna add to such a niche genre, you may as well target it towards that niche audience. Like, there's no point trying to expand your horizons when you already have no real fan base to build upon in the first place. Like, the idea that you can just insert yourself as a creator into this niche genre that you have absolutely no knowledge of is why shit like Comicsgate happens. But that's I'm getting off topic. This isn't about people like entitled creators or anything. This is about what is this video about? Oh yeah, realism in games. Sorry. Okay, I was meant to have like a guest, but he obviously doesn't think I'm important enough to actually, fulfill his promises. So he can fuck off and he can do without the what's the word? The exposure. Have fun being a nobody, you dickhead. But now for the opposite of nobodies, huge thanks to my 2 top-tier patrons, along with all of the other ones. Can't believe I actually forgot to say your names. Stolen Dragoon and Ori Main. Thank you very, very much. I like that fucking Darkside Phil clip. It's like, thank you very much. Although I don't really like comparing myself to Darkside Phil. There's links to social media in the description, like in the bottom of the description. Yeah, thanks for watching. What do you think about realism in games? The consensus seems to be that it's sort of cancerous and nobody actually likes it, but realistic games continue to sell millions upon millions of sales, so some of you must be lying.